So welcome to another episode of The Shredder Show. Today, we're absolute pleasure. We've got superstar guest, coach extraordinaire, Calum Raistrick from the Muscle Mentors. So today we're going to talk through building maximal muscle tissue, which is something Calum's done himself with an incredible amount of tissue you've built, which I saw an old video of you the other day cropped up somewhere and I was like, is that the same person? So welcome to the podcast, Calum.
Thank you very much, mate. Thank you for the immense introduction.
So to start off on that note, how much muscle have you added the last few years out of interest, actually?
The first time I competed was in 2019, and I was 202 pounds the morning of that show. And then I pushed up over the last kind of 16 months. I pushed up just over 100 pound. Okay. And then this is the first time I've pulled down and reset from that first push, and I'm about 280 pounds now. And I reckon if I were to diet for another 10 to 12 weeks and took maybe 30 more pounds off, I'd probably be in the mid 240s on stage. So that's like 45 pounds of tissue in a year.
100%. I think, like, looking at some of your recent pictures as well, you're still very lean at that weight as well, which is impressive feat. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. Well, how tall are you?
6'4".
It's a big guy as well, so it's a lot of frame to fill out.
It takes time, man. It takes time. That's the thing, though. Like, you know, when I was 200 pounds, to have another 100 pounds of body mass added from that and still not be, I don't want to say not in proportion, but to still not be quite there in terms of filling out that frame, it just shows how much is needed for a taller guy.
100%. I think that's one of the things why, from the outside looking in, like what you do, I've always been so impressed because you practice what you preach so well, which is always awesome to see in terms from a coaching level of things. From your side of things, obviously you mentioned coming out of like your last show, how you've grown exponentially from there. Like, we'll go into the first subject of that, of like optimizing that window sort of post show or post diet with people, say post holidays, and we used to be able to do those sort of things.
Yeah.
Crazy world we're in. Do you have a specific tactic in terms of how you've managed that yourself and with your clients? Or do you try and keep people relatively lean with that sort of phase, or do you jump calories up quite quickly?
I think one thing you've got to appreciate when an individual is that lean, when body fat is that low, we're going to be in a position where there's going to be quite an excessive degree of supercompensation regardless of what we do. So immediately post-show or post-shoe or post-holiday, when you are in that highly responsive state, the goal shouldn't be to open up the toolbox and exhaust all the tools very quickly. And that can come from, you know, calories, that can come from workload with training. The goal should be to try and get the most from the least for as long as possible, and then add to it when that progress starts stalling. So immediately off the bat from my show, there was an initial calorie escalation, and that initial calorie escalation was essentially there to just shift fatigue and put me back into a place where I could actually recover and I wasn't in prep ultimately. And then it would just reset to that initial set point, and then we just slowly move from there. I think one thing that people get into the habit of doing when they are in that post-show period, especially when motivation is high to make progress, is they'll just exhaust those avenues too quickly and then find themselves starting to tread water a little bit quicker than they needed to in that off-season phase. Whereas, you know, I've extended out that period of improvement for just over a year by being incredibly patient with how I was approaching it, as opposed to being too aggressive from the offset and then starting to realistically lose variables to actually adjust when the time's right. Like, just like you would in a diet, you know, if you had a client that was losing 2 pounds a week every single week in a diet, and that was keeping them on track to get in condition for a show or a shoot or a holiday, you know, let's try and sustain that 2 pound a week loss for as long as possible. We wouldn't suddenly cut the calories and add cardio if they were continuously losing 2 pounds. And it's the same as that post-show period. Like, if we're able to progress training sessions, recover, you know, if we're slowly, you know, managing that progression whilst holding body composition and staying lean and sensitive, we don't need to be adding food and we don't need to be pushing training volume. So it's only adjusting those variables when absolutely needed. And I think the one thing that people go wrong with is they just struggle to have that level of patience in a period of time when motivation is so high to make progress.
It's one of those things, almost chasing it too fast.
100%, yeah.
And with that phase, do you think those people trying to push the calories too quickly out of the gate and try and take their food up too fast?
Yeah, like the thing is, in a situation like that, you're going to have such a high level of insulin sensitivity. Your ability to partition food is going to be exceptional, but it doesn't mean that we have to completely fill that quota immediately. We can still gradually build to it. So, out of that post-show window, if we are getting really nitty-gritty with the ability to regulate that, we can be looking at, autonomic markers, tracking blood glucose management, all these things that basically show us what's happening when we look at putting food in the body and what we're essentially doing with that food. And we can then govern how quickly we can realistically add calories by what's happening from a blood glucose management perspective relative to our ability to partition that food, and what's happening compositionally as well. People want to add calories quickly, but they don't necessarily need to add them.
Do you, say with your own case as an example, did you add your calories primarily from carbohydrates back in first to try and improve training performance?
Yeah, I'm not a huge advocate of super high fat unless it's required from a calorie density perspective to bring food volume down, or if we're running what I'd refer to as kind of a reset phase where the goal is to improve insulin sensitivity and reduce carbohydrates. So I think in the back end of prep, my dietary fat was at like maybe 35 or 40 grams tracked per day on my FitnessPal, so everything included. And now it sits at about 80 grams a day. So it's doubled from what it was, but it was very low in prep, but it hasn't gone super high. Like for the most part, if we look at what our most readily available fuel substrate is, it's going to be carbohydrate. And as long as we can maintain the ability to utilize those carbs, then that's realistically going to be our primary go-to when we look at calorie escalation. And the same goes for protein. There may be an argument that we could manipulate protein year round based on the phase, but realistically in a phase like this for me now, protein escalation is probably going to have more of a harm than natural value, because the higher I push that protein intake, realistically, A, it's not needed, and B, I'm just increasing the load on my GI as well. So carbohydrates would be my most logical tool to use there, yeah.
That was going to be my next question. Is obviously, as your food, in particular with someone like yourself, is such a big frame, probably needs a huge amount of calories to get you to where you want to be. It's almost that fine balance of managing the digestion whilst taking the calories up and not overdoing it, which I think is where people go very heavy on protein straight away. And I think that's what causes a lot of problems.
Yeah, 100%. Like my protein year round will sit somewhere between, 280 to 300 grams a day. So if I'm eating 5 meals, I'll probably have, around 60 grams of protein per meal. But if I'm 300 pounds, then that works out around 1 gram per pound. So it's not a crazy high amount. And that's with everything tracked as well. That's like trace protein from carbs and everything.
Yeah, you literally words out my mouth. That's literally what I was about to say. If you're about 280, 300 and you weigh around that, you're about a pound per gram of body weight, which is sort of what I do. I tend to sit about 210, 220 grams and pounds-ish weight-wise. So I tend to balance it out together as well. So
the amount of I've seen it countless times where you'll have people pushing into an off season. You'll have clients that consult with you in an off season where they're struggling from the standpoint of regulating the ability to manage their GI, the ability to manage appetite or digestion in general, or motility. And you'll look at the diet and protein will just be astronomically high, just because it's the whole, innate bodybuilder trend of I've got to have 350, 400, 450 grams a day. Realistically, we're going to get to a certain point where we can only maximize and tap out that threshold of MPS so much, and everything above that amount, if I was going to eat 500 grams of protein a day, it's not going to give me another 30-40% when it comes to regulating muscle protein synthesis and driving anabolism. So, and an increase in nitrogen retention. So it's just going to increase the load on my GI. So often pulling protein down to a much lower set point will alleviate a lot of those digestive symptoms straight away. And especially when calories are high, like that is the perfect time to pull protein down and utilize other macronutrients like carbs, for example, because they are going to be much easier to break down from a pancreatic and an acidic perspective in the GI. You could argue in prep, that could be a time where we push protein a little bit higher because You might find some satiety benefits from higher protein in prep, or you could argue potentially, especially for someone that's unassisted in prep, there could be some preservative benefits from higher protein intake in terms of maintaining lean mass and driving more anabolism in prep. But high protein more often than not is definitely not the way to go.
100%. It's interesting. For the first time, I worked with Dr. Dean quite closely, and he, I said to him, "I was like, let's try this. I wanted to drop my protein down because I was previously doing around 300 grams a day. I was like, when I was dieting, it's like, let's drop my protein down and bring my carbs back up, because I just cut my carbs down and I was literally starting to hit a wall. And I was like, let's just drop the protein down, take the carbs back up. And I felt like night and day difference for exactly the same amount of calories, and progress just continued. And it's one of those things that you have to sometimes, I think when you're more experienced, you're more aware of how you feel. But I think it's, as you said, everyone gets stuck in the same route of almost copying everyone else, that you have to do 300 grams of protein or whatever it might be. And they just follow along what everyone else does.
And that's a perfect example as well of you in a calorie deprived state, you in an energy deficit, and overfeeding on that protein isn't necessarily giving you any benefit. Whereas we look at the ability to metabolize that carbohydrate and use it as fuel, then we're having an immediate impact for the same calories on recovery, satiety, performance. So, from an energy balance perspective, yes, you could probably argue there'd be a minuscule difference in terms of the thermic effect of the foods you're eating, but we're talking like tiny amounts. And you've just taken the same energy balance, so you're still going to mobilize the same amount of body fat and body weight, but you've just completely preserved your ability to perform and recover just from manipulating the balance and split of those macros.
In regards to digestion, do you have like particular strategies you tend to use yourself with clients in terms of optimizing that as you're taking calories up across like an off season?
So I think especially when food starts to get high, and even from the standpoint of as we're kind of moving into an off season phase and we're starting to build into that diet, getting a pool of foods that we know and trust, when we look at, yes, they're palatable, so we know we can eat them even when hunger is a little bit lower, because hunger signaling is not going to be sky high forever. But they're not pro-inflammatory. They're not going to create a negative response when it comes to the ability to break those foods down. So for me, for example, like if my carbs are super high, the majority of my carbs will be rice based. So I'll have creamy rice, jasmine rice. The majority of the carbs will be rice, because I just process that the most efficiently. So it's eliminating any of the foods that we know set us back a little bit in terms of digestibility. And we can see that from, irregularity in stools and motility. We can see that when it comes to how you feel post-meal, how it impacts blood glucose management. But obviously food selection is a massive one. And then just from the standpoint of looking at the power the nervous system has over the digestive tract, and you'll see, especially from the Muscle Mentors way of coaching, you'll see a big shift to the focus on the autonomic nervous system in this parasympathetic and sympathetic state, and the flux between the two, and the power of driving clients and athletes into a parasympathetic state around meal times. Because when we're in this sympathetic state, when we're in this chronically stressed state, and that can be related to lifestyle, sleep, prep, whatever, we're going to get a certain suppression of processes within the GI, process within, saliva being produced or enzymes and acids being produced in the GI to break this food down. We're going to get some suppression within the secretion of those tools, and those tools play a massive role in digestion. So, instead of looking at just focusing on the diet and the foods you're eating, let's look at how a client's actually approaching a meal. Are they sitting down and eating in a low stress state? Are they chewing food thoroughly? And most time people are on autopilot when they're eating food. They're not really aware of what they're doing. They're just shoveling food down and then getting back to the laptop and doing check-ins again. So we're being more aware of, especially when food is high, we've got to put the body and the nervous system in the best place to actually break that food down in the first place.
It's one of those things I think is very interesting, is that a lot of the very top level bodybuilders aren't very type A, like go driven personalities. Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting correlation between them having the best physiques in their world and probably like not being stressed all the time.
Yeah, 100%. You see that all the time as well. Like somebody I was speaking to last night, where there's two people that come to mind. Oscar, who's a really close friend of mine, Oscar in Manchester. And he's called Young 4040 on Instagram.
Yeah, I know Oscar.
and Josh Maley. Josh Maley is the most chilled person you'll ever meet in your life, but he's also Mr. Universe, amateur and pro. And you do get that a lot with these elite level athletes, the ability to remain calm, not let things aggravate them across the day, stay in that low stress state, sleep well, just focus on the task at hand, live in that little kind of bodybuilding bubble, so to speak. And it produces the best athletes because they're not constantly overthinking and stressed about every little degree.
Is that something you actively work with your clients you're coaching?
Yeah, like this is where the whole notion of having your kind of non-negotiables across the day and across the week, and having your boxes that you need to tick, and then the fixation over, especially from an athlete perspective, just focusing on what is in your control and then not playing so much emotional attachment to what's not. Because most of the time, like if we can optimize what is in our control, then we're going to continue moving forwards in the right direction. It's the people and the client personality type and the psyche type that do tend to overthink a lot, and that internal stress that's created from that can be very, very damaging in that situation.
100%. I think in particular with this scenario of the uncertainty of the global climate, to keep it short of that, there's a lot of that going on, and that's something not from what's going on at the moment, but I personally have found as a challenge with having a lot of plate spinning. So I've actually started working with like a performance psychologist to try and help me control that. And it instantly, that's been like life-changing, just creating more control within my life. So that's something I'm a big advocate for doing. I think a lot of like big gym guys are too, too hardcore or too macho to almost talk about that. But I think the mental side of things has such an influence on everything. I think the more people understand their own minds and the way they think, the better the results they'll get with everything they do.
100%. And you'll see that in it. I think you'll see that in every industry. The people at the very top are the people that have, spent time and done work in terms of mastering the ability to, control mindset and look at the psychology behind that. And a lot of those elite level guys in whatever industry, especially sport, the psychological side of that is a huge component.
100%. Now, with come back to the sort of topic at hand, coming out of a leaner state, would you look to taper people down in terms of cardiovascular work? Would you stop that cold turkey? What's your opinion on cardio in the off season generally?
The majority of clients will have significantly tapered, if not removed, that additional output before the actual end show, because we would, in an ideal world, get them into a position, but before they peak for that show or that shoot, they're in the lowest stress state possible, because we can only manipulate calories and manipulate these little variables to create a better presentable package if stress is low. If stress is high, things are going to be super unpredictable. So cardio in particular and training volume will be ideally brought down to a minimal set point, or as minimal as we can, before the actual show or the shoot. Now, there is definitely merit in terms of continuing to keep some aerobic conditioning within the off season, especially for a bigger bodybuilder, especially for a bodybuilder that's gonna, if we look at what gets most people, and we're more so looking at the assisted realm of bodybuilders now, but it will apply to anyone in terms of health management long term. If an individual is putting on a lot of lean mass and they're carrying a lot of body mass for a long period of time, a lot of the complications that come from an individual's health is simply due to the stress that body weight has on their physiology and their heart long term. And the heart is just like any other tissue in the body. We've essentially got to train it and make it adapt. So keeping some aerobic conditioning in across the year, in my opinion, is actually essential for not only maintaining the longevity of the athlete's career, but their health. And also, you can also argue, as long as we're doing it in a way that doesn't impede recovery, and for the most part in an off-season phase, it's going to be non-glycolytic. It's going to be probably, around 120 beats per minute, non-glycolytic cardio, what we'd refer to as kind of steady state, I guess. As long as it's not impacting recovery negatively, it's only going to have a positive training from the standpoint, positive impact from the standpoint of training. So, maintaining a higher level of work capacity when they're at a heavier body weight in the off season. There's nothing worse than, if I'm at 300 pounds and I'm not walking the dog, or I'm not doing a little bit of activity across the day, you put me in a set above 8 reps and I'm keeling over, falling off a bench, or crawling myself out of a leg press, because we lose the ability to work in those more kind of higher end rep ranges, just from a cardiovascular perspective in terms of conditioning. So it has a multifaceted level of value in an off season. In prep, we're using it to essentially manipulate energy balance for the most part, but in off season, it then comes into health markers. It comes into the ability to maintain performance at heavier body weights. It's something that people will see as not necessarily conducive to muscle gain, but I personally view it as something that is going to benefit muscle gain as opposed to hinder it if it's managed appropriately.
How would you normally look to structure that in? I presume you'd put that just on rest days to keep it away from training?
So like if somebody was training 5 days a week, then they might have 2 conditioning sessions across the week on those rest days. And we just do it in a way that we knew, and we could monitor this as well, but we do it in a way that we knew wouldn't negatively impact their training sessions for the week.
What's your opinion on HIIT cardio in that scenario in the off season? I presume steer clear generally because of the impact on recovery?
Yeah, and we've got to think as well, when we look at what we're actually trying to adapt and the threshold, the kind of the energy system and the threshold that we're going to tap into and make, we're trying to make aerobic adaptations. Now, the anaerobic side and the glycolytic side is being tapped into when we actually train. So when we're looking at, especially in an off-season phase, from the standpoint of minimizing the risk on impeding recovery and generating those aerobic adaptations, we're looking at, generally speaking, lower heart rate threshold activity, so more steady state work.
100%. That's one of the things I think too many people try and do is they go too heavy with the cardio all the time, and then they just end up spinning their wheels. And
that goes for prep as well. Like it goes for prep in terms of you're going to have a big impact on energy balance, but it's the consequence that comes at. If we're doing HIIT 5 times a week, or you're doing HIIT, even if it's sometimes less than that, it's the ability to maintain training output and recovery whilst that's in alongside. And typically speaking, one of them is going to suffer for most people.
So you mentioned there in terms of energy balance, with when you're pushing your clients through the off season, do you have a set point you would be looking for them to be in terms of a rough surplus, or you literally just go based upon their check-ins weekly, how they're going, just incrementally take food up, probably mainly from carbohydrates as you go?
Yeah, I'm the way I coach is very reactive in terms of what I'm seeing on a week-to-week basis in terms of feedback. Instead of being proactive, where I'll like lay out, right, this is how the next 4 months is going to go, and this is what we're going to do at week 8, week 10, week 12.
I 100% agree with that, because I thought, like, realistically, you can say whatever you like, but no one knows what's going to happen. You're taking an educated guess.
Exactly. You've got to read what's in front of you at the end of the day. And even if you were to, sometimes I'll map out a timeline and I'll be like, right, this is a rough idea of how this is going to look, so the client can have some clarity in terms of what they're heading into. But it's very rarely what I've actually put on paper to the exact point. It's always going to change in some degree.
And do you normally work with people looking to try and go up like certain weights per week in terms of body weight, or would you be looking for their weight to progress, or again just go on visual and then also training performance and strength increases?
Yeah, I think collectively you'll look at multiple variables. Like body weight is no doubt a variable that we can track and take progression from, but we've got to be looking at having that multi-pronged, where performance is, where recovery is, where's body composition in their photos, what's happening with body weight. And even a week where body weight potentially holds, but we've seen an escalation in performance and recovery has been fantastic, that's still a week where we've won. So we're trying to look at multiple variables there as opposed to one. And I think more often than not, the more fixated we are over body weight in an off season and just driving that number up, the more blinded we can actually be when it comes to actually making progress. I think in prep, when we're in an energy deficit, maintaining a certain rate of loss keeps us on track and keeps us on schedule and gives us a target and gives something tangible to hit. But in an off-season phase, setting a rate of gain target can be a little bit risky, because if we're making decisions to force that body weight up when we don't necessarily need to, there's definitely going to be an increased risk of them driving more adiposity or more body fat on at a heightened rate when not necessarily needing to go to that point so soon, if that makes sense.
100%. From personal experience, whenever I've done that, or I've seen it done with other people, it never tends to end very well.
Because you just get blinded by the fact that, oh, I haven't gained 1 pound, so I'm going to have to add more food. And it's like, well, if you take a step back, how's your training on this week? How have you recovered? Like, have you beaten? Have you hit your volume landmarks? So have you progressed your sessions? And they've said yes to every single one. It's like, why have you increased your food?
And it's also how's your digestion? Because I find a lot of people, when they get to the point where they're trying to push their calories up and their weight's not going up, their digestion's a complete mess.
100%.
And they just try and throw more food in. And I'm like, you're just making a bigger problem for yourself. Like, this isn't helping the scenario. With anything, it'd be better off taking the food back for a little while and then going back up again.
Exactly. It's adding to that systemic stress. And what you just said there in terms of pulling food down and then pushing back up is something that, I'll call it resetting when I do it with clients. But this is something I've done for the last year myself, and it's something I religiously do with clients, especially male clients who typically have to push food a little bit more aggressively. Is I'll take them to the upper end of what I feel is their threshold for pushing food and maintaining appetite and maintaining the function of their GI on that level of food and progress. And I'll pull them down before I feel as though we've before I feel as though we've crossed that point. So it may be, for, Joe Brightman could be a good example where in this off-season phase, we might have had 10 weeks of pushing where we've put on 6-7 pounds. Now I know that I could probably squeeze another 3 or 4 weeks out of that phase, no issue. But by the end of that 4 weeks, he's going to be a little bit more inflamed. Blood glucose management is going to be a bit more of an issue. Appetite is starting to diminish. And if we push beyond that capacity and that threshold, that's going to be weeks and weeks and weeks of me trying to fix that. So I'll push him to that end point. And the longer you work with someone, the better you get this. You better get monitoring it. We've done the same thing with Dean as well. It's pushing to that point and then pulling back for a couple of weeks, and that could just be like resetting, pull protein down, pull food volume down, pull calories down a little bit, lower stress, and then push back up. And when you push back up, they're in this super responsive state again. So they just push that little bit higher, then you pull down again, and then you push it back up again. And it works a treat. And realistically, keeping athletes lean, keeping athletes sensitive, keeping athletes healthy, sustaining the longevity of progress over a long period of time is the only way we can do it and still progress for 6, 8, 10, 12 months.
That was something I was going to bring up, is that what I've noticed with a lot of your guys, why they progress so well is they've done very long off seasons, but they've also stayed conditioned for a long period of time. And do you put that down to the fact that you're going up and down quite a lot, like you said, with reset phases, just to almost try and mitigate the adipose tissue going too high, if that makes sense?
100%. Yeah, 100%. It's something that works really, really well for males and females, but it's I think keeping athletes sensitive, keeping athletes it's keeping them in a place where they're recovering and they're responding and not trying to push too far north of that at any point across the year.
Visually, do you have anything you look for on that side of things? Is it where people start losing their abs, or is it very person dependent in that respect?
In terms of body composition?
Yeah, body composition. When you look at resetting with people,
there'll be a tolerance there in terms of the level of change from body composition, but I'll have a little bit of leeway, especially for bigger males. There'll be a little bit more leeway in terms of how much body fat I'll allow to accumulate. But looking beyond body composition, if we were to see in a gaining phase, the metrics that I'm tracking, like sleep start to diminish, resting heart rate start to increase, blood pressure start to increase, particularly when it comes to nutrition and their ability to partition food, blood glucose management start to compromise, and that starts to increase gradually over time. That's the point where the body is essentially telling you, that's me done in terms of making progress in this push, and I need to reset, and I need to resensitize, and then need to go again. Because for the most part, most people, not most people, but if you look at this a year ago, when you started talking about an Oura ring and a glucometer and a blood pressure cuff, people would just kind of turn the lip up at you and say, oh, I didn't do that 10 years ago, so I don't need to do it now. But we didn't really know how to apply it 10 years ago. Now we do. And this is why it's such a valuable tool, because it's showing you internally what's going on, as opposed to just looking at a photo and being like, oh, is he fat enough yet for me to stop or not? You know, it's telling us what actually, how we can kind of plot this stuff over time in terms of metrics, and that data is invaluable.
I think something I'm a huge fan of is Oura rings. I think for the fact, just people being more aware of their own sleep and their activity, and by you being more aware of it, there's no doubt that you'll improve that and that will have a beneficial effect overall.
And like, you know, it's something you can track on your coaching sheets, but something I've found with like I've had clients use Oura rings, Whoop straps, all these different things. It's educating them on their own recovery ability. And, you know, although I'm monitoring the data and analyzing it on a weekly basis, because they're seeing it day to day, they're becoming more aware of, oh, you know, last night I did this before I went to bed, or I drank that, or I had my last meal at that point, and I've seen this percent this morning when I woke up. So they're becoming more aware of how to optimize that within their own day, as opposed to me almost, sometimes I don't even need to tell them what to do, because they'll become in tune with that just from tracking it themselves.
Intuitive. A great example with, personally with that is that I used to like eating quite close to going to bed, until I clocked that my resting heart rate was super high all the time whenever I did that.
Yeah.
As soon as I pull that back and I had my last meal, say 2 hours before going to bed, it'd be 4 to 5 beats per minute less over the night, which is a big difference.
100%, massively. And it's that proximity to bedtime, especially for bodybuilders and physique athletes who are on a large amount of food, that can completely cripple sleep quality. When we look at the escalation in, because of the digestive processes and resting heart rate, and you can also look at the relationship between bile production and sleep quality. You know, pulling that last meal forwards, you know, a couple of hours before bedtime, like you said, is something that, you know, every single person I've done that with is it has a positive impact on recovery and sleep. And that kind of age-old bodybuilder habit of, I have my last meal right before I go to bed, because I don't want to go catabolic in my sleep. We just got to look at, right, what are the consequences actually having on the biggest tool you have for recovery in the whole toolbox, which is your sleep. Like, how can we improve that in every way we can?
100%. I think it's like that old bodybuilding myth of getting up during the night to eat as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's probably the most disruptive thing you can do.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
Take things into more of like a training tangent. What's your like specific approach for that? I know obviously you do a lot of work in terms of more like progressive overload. I know you were doing some fortitude training at Scott Stevenson's a while ago, I believe.
Yeah, did some fortitude stuff last year for sure. Yeah, I did that actually in the first lockdown. In March last year I started that because of A, limited kit, and B, limited time, because everyone needed home workouts. So it's like, right, I'm gonna drop down to, I started on 3 days a week and then moved up to 4, and I ran that for about 4 or 5 months.
How did you find that? I'm interested.
It was very different to start with, training 3 days a week, but it was a lot of fun as well. I'm a big fan of Scott, and if anyone ever gets a chance to read his books, Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach in particular as well, he's got fantastic content. But fortitude is something where I like the way that he separates the volume into tiers. So he's got this like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 3 is something that I don't feel as though any human could recover from ever.
It's like the turbo tier, isn't it?
It's ridiculous. And then tier 1 and tier 2, you can dip in and out of that, as you know, based on your own ability to auto-regulate your recovery, which I like a lot, because it gives you some structure as to how you can manipulate that based on how you feel. But you know, increasing training frequency to that level, you know, some tissues being trained 4 times a week, that was definitely novel, and there was most definitely some novel adaptation as a result of that. And it was a lot of fun, but it's very, very hard. And I think once you get to a certain point, it will be, I think long term, it will be extremely difficult to continue progressing performance in a framework like that when you are relatively strong. So like if I was hip hinging and squatting, and you know, especially when I was training in the garage, I was squatting twice a week. It just completely battered me. So I think I lasted 4.5 months, and then I had to throw in the white flag before I broke. But yeah, that was productive. It was a lot of fun. I definitely recommend having a go if you haven't before.
Yeah, the muscle round days are interesting as well. That's something I
Yeah.
found. I was traveling around a lot at the start of last year when you were allowed to do that, and I found those particularly helpful for when traveling with limited equipment, and it's just
Yeah.
easy to try and keep your training up and not have to be too stressed about schedule.
Yeah. I think if anyone's listening and they are training at home and they've got a relatively good skill set when it comes to training and execution, Fortitude is a pretty sweet setup in terms of home training. If you've got some dumbbells, maybe a pull-up bar, and some bands, you could set up something pretty nice at home.
Yeah, you don't need a lot of equipment for that.
Not at all.
With your approach generally in terms of training, do you have a specific way you tend to like to train your clients or methodology?
I've got principles in terms of what I'd look to do within a phase and how I'd look to set up a program. But a lot of that, I'll kind of pride myself in the fact that a lot of that will differ from client to client relative to the situation they're in, relative to the goal, their ability to recover, what they need to actually focus on within that phase. And, for a more base tier client that is either Gen Pop or just wants to kind of get in shape, or they don't necessarily have any highly competitive goals and they just want to progress, doesn't necessarily need to be as detailed and meticulous as if I was, programming for someone that's going into their first pro show or trying to turn pro, for example. But we're still following the same principles. Like, we're still looking at micromanaging recovery, starting a phase with the least amount of workload possible, and then adjusting from there as we need to. Regardless of how you're packaging volume across the week, and regardless of exercise selection that you're picking, and relatively speaking, that exercise selection needs to be relative to their structure and their kind of makeup from an anatomical perspective. We're essentially looking at maximizing their ability to execute what they're executing first, and then intensifying that from there. So learning how to train first, and learning how to generate tension through a tissue and brace and stabilize, etc. And then once they have the skill set, then they can start to add load or add volume, or both. I think most people will kind of have that inverse relationship of throwing the kitchen sink at it, but not really optimizing anything, as opposed to starting from the bare basics of learning how to train and then starting to advance that from there, if that makes sense.
100%. I think it's one of those things, people forego the skill acquisition stage and they want to go straight into like the intensifiers of let's do triple drop sets, rest pause sets, let's do everything, rather than like thinking, okay, how can I make this one straight set of 8 to 10 the most difficult and perfect thing I can do? Yeah,
100%. And we can talk about this all day, but like from a more beginner level client, the most simple thing we can do for that, for example, would be in the initial stages of coaching, pick a pool of exercises we want to choose that they do have the ability to, they have the kit available for one. But the simple skill of, using an extremely slow tempo, both eccentrically and concentrically, and getting them to do maybe 3-second concentric, 3-second eccentric, and get them to just generate the most intense and accurate intramuscular tension they can through an exercise for a set of, say, 8 to 12. And then over time, not only can we broaden that exercise selection, but a client needs to earn the right to move with speed, and a client needs to earn the right to move with load. And that initial stage of coaching, the reason why we're picking those slower tempos is, A, it's very easy to develop, to increase and maximize metabolic stress when they're moving slower through under load. And if we look at the mechanisms, metabolic stress will equate to mechanical tension. So we're getting that training response. Now, for a beginner client, we don't necessarily need to inflict a lot of muscle damage for them to progress. So we're not looking at, for a beginner client, to overload consistently across the phase. We're looking at for them to train efficiently first and recover. And then once we get a little bit more advanced, it's taking those initial skill sets and now getting them stronger with the skills they've already learned. Because, someone like yourself, any of your what you'd classify as your advanced clients, long term, there needs to be an element of progression there in terms of, the stimulus that we're putting on that tissue and the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system's ability to adapt to that. But we've got to earn the right to do that in the first place, if that makes sense.
100%. I also think I'll use myself as a case in point, as I've done a few times. I've started working with a chap called Nick Loff. So Nick's an absolute G, so shout out to him. So he's started helping me with my training side of stuff, just to really pull me apart and like really nail stuff down. And one of the big things we've been doing is very similar to you saying, like slowing down the eccentrics and concentrics of movements so that I literally have no choice but try and stimulate the muscle I'm trying to use. And it's quite eye-opening as how difficult you can make an exercise when you really like nail it and slow it down. And I often get, and I imagine your clientele, some of them might be more advanced, but I often get say, oh, this workout's too easy. I'm like, trust me, it's not too easy. It's the way you take out the workout and execute it is a whole other thing. And like, I'll look at workouts sometimes, I'm like, this is going to be pretty easy. And then by the end of it, you're broken. You're like, yeah, it's harder than I thought.
Yeah, like it's not what's on paper, it's the ability to apply what's on paper, isn't it? Like, I mean, in that first lockdown, I had my entire lower body session was 3 sets of heel wedge safety bar squats and 3 sets of occluded walking lunges. And that was it for the entire session, because I knew that, you know, to create a full contractile challenge with what I had, that was plenty. And if I put everything I had into those 6 sets total, then that's me boxed off for the day, that's done. But it takes a certain mindset to take yourself to that place, and it also takes a certain skill. And for a beginner client, they may need a little bit more workload to gain a sufficient amount of stimulus to adapt, because the intensity and the accuracy isn't quite there yet. But over time, you know, as that accuracy starts to build and as that intensity builds, they could probably get away with doing a little bit less than what they were doing initially, because they're getting more out of less workload, if that makes sense.
You literally took the words out of my mouth. I was literally thinking the first thing is the skill of training intensely is what people don't understand. And it takes a while to build up to that. Or like, and I find the best way that people learn that is training with someone who's experienced. You can really push them. And I remember, I think like 3-4 years ago, I trained with James Hollingshead for like 2-3 weeks. And like the first time I trained with him, I was like, Jesus Christ, like it's eye-opening, because you think you train hard and then you train with someone else. You're like, I was only going like 5 out of 10. Like, what have I been doing? Like, and that's why I think it's so important. The people you surround yourself with, the people you're coached by, the people you train with, the gyms you train in when you can train in gyms, has such a big influence, I think, on your end result often.
Yeah, and I take James as an example. Some of that you can ingrain in someone and mold and learn, and some of that is just in them, and that's why they're at that level. And that's very rare, but it's why, you know, there's only one James Hollingshead in the world, because he's got that instinct in him. And when you train with these guys, and it was the same with me training with Jordan last year, it's just they're able to take themselves to a different place psychologically, and that equates to a different level of performance and a different level to attack a set. And it's something that does definitely, I don't want to say rub off on you, but you definitely take something away from that when you can experience it firsthand, for sure.
Yeah, it's flipping the switch. On that note, do you have any tips or tricks you do for yourself to personally get yourself into that? Do you have anything, like, what do you listen to in the gym?
Well, mostly like metal and rock. I'm not a big fan of like the hip hop gangster stuff. I'm more kind of a metal kind of guy, but I think I'm quite methodical in my approach, and then as soon as it's time for that set, then I can kind of switch on properly. But it's I can't kind of go when I'm moving into a session. Like, I'll just remain pretty calm, breathe, play some music, and that's me kind of visualizing what I want to do. And then when it's time for the set, then I'll breathe heavily a few times, make some noise, and then get on with it. But it's something that I've learned over time. Like, the more aggravated and aggressive I get to my approach, the more accuracy I lose within the set, if that makes sense. Like, if I'm shouting and screaming and, you know, pulling the bar off the rack, I'm forgetting all the cues that I need to remember to actually execute that movement. And right, you know, how do I want to move here? What speed do I want to move at? And at the skill set I'm at, and you know, I'm by no means, you know, elite level, you know, top tier, but with anyone like that, take James for example as a perfect example. His ability to train in terms of a skill, he doesn't even need to think about. Like, if you put him under a bar and squat, he's going to contract what he needs to contract. But it's the ability to take yourself through those sets and not lose focus on the task. And I think being too aggressive does actually almost have a negative influence as opposed to a positive one.
100%. And I've personally found that massively. Whenever I get myself almost too hyped up, you then end up, your form goes out the window, and like you end up throwing it from the the bottom of the hack squat or whatever you're doing, and those are the sets where you end up getting little niggles or you pull something because you're not actually thinking about embracing your core or what you're actually doing. You're just thinking about how can I move this from A to B.
100%, definitely.
So yeah, I think that's something for people probably to take home from. With obviously your own progression as a coach, Calum, as an athlete, like who have you learned the most from, and who are you continuing your education with going forwards?
So I was my first ever coach was James, who actually works with the Muscle Mentors now. So James was the first person who ever coached me. And then over the last couple of years, it's just been taking little bits from multiple people. I've done, especially from a pharmacological perspective, a lot of work with Dean, a lot of work with Joe Jeffrey. As a business, obviously, I'm blessed to have a lot of wise minds around me from a training standpoint. So James and Luke have had a big influence over my own programming and how I program for clients, which is why we've kind of created that team in the first place. But I guess, internally, the rest of the guys have had a big influence over my own programming. Michael Goulden at Integra, who teaches the RTS. Again, RTS is something that if you are a bodybuilder or a PT, delving into that from an educational side, I think will be the biggest game changer when it comes to your ability to program and look at exercise in a different format. And that's not just for PT clients who are coaching Gen Pop. That's for people who are coaching physique athletes as well, because it does play a huge role in your ability to program in an efficient manner and create programming for clients with specific goals, and whether they're working around specific ailments or they've got tissues that they need to develop and you need to figure out why it's not been progressing in the past, or how they need to approach execution or exercise selection in a different way. That plays a massive role. That's the beauty of the industry. It's just it's collaborating with people who have more experience in areas that you don't, and being honest enough and being open-minded enough to listen to other people and learn and absorb.
So that's the way I look at it. I want to be like a sponge. I don't want to get certain pieces of knowledge from different people and then pull all these pieces together into my own brain, my own training, my own business, and everything I do. And I think that's the fun of the process of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not like in computer games anymore, but it's like leveling up on like Call of Duty is the way I look at it. You're constantly like acquiring these skills to try and scale the mountain of your own knowledge and your own physique and your own business and everything you do.
Yeah, and like the take it as a prime example, it's the guys and girls that we'll go to for that knowledge. If you look at their careers, they've all done the same thing. They've all had their own mentors. They've all had their own educators they've learned from. So it's just a process of whatever field and discipline you want to kind of specialize in and become a master of, so to speak, over time. It's learning from the people who have been there and done it and can actually teach you, the method that they've put in place and what they've learned over that time frame.
I think one of the things that I was guilty of this when I was younger, and I think a lot of people can be guilty of this, almost like too much arrogance, that they think they know everything. I think like particular chauvinistic young men, early 20s, sound like my dad now, but that you think you know everything just because you've built a certain amount of muscle, you've done X, Y, Z. And I think it's one of those things you suddenly come to realization at some point in life where you will never know everything and you will never be the best at something. There's always someone bigger, stronger, faster than you, and you just need to be open-minded and aware to keep on learning, as it were.
Yeah, 100%. Like one thing that we say, like within our group of coaches, is like the minute you think you've mastered it is the minute you stop improving, and that's so true. It's really it's a very dangerous thing being in a position where you stop learning, you stop all that self-development stuff, and you think, right, I'm good to go now, because it will ultimately be your demise, because everyone else is going to continue learning and you're not. And things evolve as well. Like we can still see literature coming out now over any topic, areas and topics and things that we, as a discipline, things that we specialize in, everything's constantly evolving relative to things that are being found out, new literature, new ways of thinking. So if we're not keeping up to date with that, then essentially we're falling behind.
Yes, just complacency. What would you say, is there anything you think is coming up into the fitness industry you think is going to be completely novel or game changing from a training and nutrition side of things? Or do you think it's just going to be a continuing evolution of just like small marginal improvements everywhere?
I just draw back to, especially from a training standpoint, I just draw back to the prevalence of exercise mechanics being more of a widespread source of education for trainers and bodybuilders and physique athletes and PTs. It really is the foundation of coaching and programming, and it's something that is completely changed the way I think in terms of how I'm dealing with clients and how I'm dealing with myself. So exercise mechanics and delving into anatomy and machine analysis and all these things are really the bread and butter of how we program in the first place. So if anything, I think that should and hopefully will become more of the forefront of, when a PT goes to do their diploma at PT school, it's things are a little bit more specialized in terms of what they need to know, as opposed to just kind of ticking boxes in an admin sheet.
Okay, so you brought this up, so I'm going to have to go into it. So I did my level 3 PT course when I was 18 and trying to work out, it was about 13 years ago. So politely, the standard of knowledge required to become a trainer was appalling. Do you think there's much actually in play to try and improve that? Because I think, in my opinion, from what I see, it's just like a factory just to sign people off and make money, in my opinion. I find it a bit disgraceful in some respects.
I think there's definitely been a lot of that in the past. I think the issue is a lot of those bigger companies that are doing that haven't advanced with the times, and they're still doing the stuff they did 10 years ago, which I think is really dangerous. Especially when that's their first exposure to education as a coach. And then they're told, right, that's your level 3 diploma, you're ready to rock. And from their mindset, it's like, right, I don't need to do anything else now. I can go and earn money and work with clients. As we both know, coaching is a continual stage of development. And, realistically, from an education perspective and a professional development perspective, you getting your diploma is you starting. It's not you finishing. It's you actually starting in the first place. I know that the PT Collective are doing their own diploma now, their own qualified certified course, which will be much better than the majority of places you'll see. So there are definitely new people doing the courses now with more of an informed, educated, calculated way of doing things. It's just going to take some time for that to become mainstream and prevalent, probably.
100%.
I think Lift the Bar, LTB, Lift the Bar do one as well. But I know the PT Collective have brought one out too, which will be definitely worthwhile doing.
Cool. One last question. What's your top 3 books you'd recommend? Can be training, mindset, business, whatever.
Ooh.
Do you think into reading?
I say I'm an audiobook kind of man.
You can audiobook counts, that's fine.
Right, let me go on my...
Are you into audiobooks while you're doing check-ins?
So, yeah, I have done that before. More dog walks. Right, well, one thing that, from a mindset perspective, which is I've found to be incredibly powerful, more so when I was first starting to coach and like instill self-belief and confidence and have that kind of long-term visual aspiration for where I wanted to go, was a lot of the stuff Tony Robbins has done in the past. And whether that is his books or, we went to UPW in London in 2017, which is like a 3-day or a 4-day, I think it might be a 3-day event. But Tony Robbins and the stuff he does on mindset and psychology is huge. Have you read his stuff before?
Yeah, I actually saw him live at Funnel Hacking Live, an event in Nashville last year.
Yeah.
And seeing someone control a room like that is insane.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's insane. He's a very impressive guy. I actually like listening to a lot of his like short motivational clips on YouTube sometimes when I first get up in the morning to get myself like fired up.
Yeah. It's crazy. Let me go on my Amazon bought list. Atomic Habits was on there last month.
Yeah, Atomic Habits probably the best book I read last year, I think. I read that at the start of the first lockdown, to be fair, and created some very good habits.
Yeah. There's one more as well that, especially from a mindset perspective, I'll find it now.
Because I think now more than ever, mindset's probably a big one I think people are struggling with.
Oh, yeah. So it's quite an old one. I don't know when this was written. Oh, no, there's an updated one, 2015. Have you heard of Psycho-Cybernetics?
Yeah, I've read it. It's a very good book.
I must have read that about 3 times. But one for, yeah, I guess like one for giving to clients as well. Like that's been something that I've made clients listen to an audiobook or buy the book and read it. There's a lot of value, especially from a coaching standpoint. There's a lot of value that can be taken out of that when it comes to client psychology and just the process in general.
Mindset. What's the future for you, Calum, then, competing wise and business wise for Muscle Mentors the next year or two?
So from a business perspective, we're very much focused on continuing to grow the team with like-minded coaches and people that want to coach at the level we want to operate at and spread the message and continue to educate and inform. But the large focus for us as a majority is continuing to grow that educational platform, continuing to grow the education portal, continue to host the events. And obviously COVID has made that a little bit more problematic in terms of live events, but that's where the website comes in. We've got a lot of stuff planned from the standpoint of the education portal for this year in terms of content and who we're getting on and what we're going to do on there. My side, I'm still deeply in love with coaching, and Luke, my business partner, is someone that he's heavily invested in education and teaching. He's heavily invested in being up to date with current literature, and Luke is someone that's taken a step back from coaching to absorb and immerse into the educational side of the business. And I've kind of, I think you'll agree with any business, you've got to have people that specialize and do well at different things, because you can't just all try and maximize and
jack of all trades then, rather than master of none.
So like the start of last year, we just had a sit down and we were like, right, we need to map out as a company logistically who's going to focus on what and what's going to be everyone individual kind of baby, so to speak. And this is where we came up with kind of like, right, I'm the director of coaching, you're the director of education, and we'll grow them respectively from both of our mindsets being 100% focused and immersed on that. And for me, coaching is still what I absolutely adore and love to do. Like that's what excites me. So to continue to grow that coaching business from my side, and I want to work with more top tier athletes. I want to work with more professional athletes. I want to work with more IPB pros. I want to work with more physique guys and girls. And 2020 should have been a big year, but wasn't because of COVID. Hopefully there'll be some pro shows this year and some pro cards as well. If 2021 goes to plan in terms of timings and the pandemic. But I guess there's big aspirations from a coaching perspective. And then I think from an individual standpoint, I'm happy as long as I'm making progress. And whether, the reason why I took a year out this year is so I could focus on my coaching. And I knew that with everything going on with work, and if I had to prep myself, I don't want to be in a position where I can't maximize them both. So I'll take another year out this year to make more progress, which is what I love to do anyway. So it's fine. And then I'll prep. I'll prep next year.
So you effectively have a 2-year off season.
2-year off season, yeah. So hopefully, I think if I can grow for another year, I reckon I can put maybe 70 pounds of muscle on between the last show and this next show, which would be very cool.
Yeah, that will be an impressive before and after photo, I think.
Same condition, but with 70 pounds more muscle, which would be cool.
Yeah, 100%. I have no shadow of a doubt that will happen with your mindset and consistency. It's just a matter of time. So we'll wrap things up there, Calum. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Where's the best place for everyone to find out about you, yourself, Muscle Mentors?
Just literally, if you just head into Google and just type in the Muscle Mentors, the website will come up. That's where the portal is. That's where the coaching inquiry stuff is. We're on YouTube. We've got a podcast, all under the same name, the Muscle Mentors. And then Instagram is just the Muscle Mentors, and all 6 of us will come up from there.
Awesome. Absolute pleasure, Calum. I'll pop all your details in the show notes so anyone else can check that out, and I hope you have an awesome day.
Thanks for having me on, man.
So that was an absolutely insane episode of the podcast with Calum. I hope you guys absolutely love that. If you guys found it helpful, insightful, and motivational, please make sure you share this to your Instagram and Facebook stories. I'll be giving you 1 free place away on the Shred and 8 program for an entire year, worth over £300 to one person who shares this on their Instagram stories or Facebook stories and tags both myself and Calum on the podcast. As always, there's 4 free ways that can help you below this podcast and the links. So we've got my CJ Shredding Squad Facebook group, which is a free Facebook group full of knowledge tips to help you in 2021. we've got my free Absolute Abs training course, which is a free abs training course with 3 different workouts, which I'll take you through step by step how to build your ultimate six-pack. Then we've got a free six-pack strategy call in which we can discuss with you directly, with myself, with the CJ coaching team, how we can get you world-class results in 2021 and help you guide out to build your dream physique. And then lastly, you can join and subscribe to my YouTube channel where I've got daily video tips going out to help you build the ultimate version of yourself. I've got some huge guests coming on for 2021. So make sure you stay listening in for the Shredder Show podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode.